The morning it finally broke open, the water came up so fast it scared her. Clara Voss had gone out to the south pasture before first light, the way she always did, lantern swinging at her knee, and the dark still thick enough to press against her face like a cloth. She was not looking for water. She was checking the herd the way you check breathing. Not expecting trouble, just making sure. But her boot heel struck limestone instead of clay, and the sound was wrong, and then the ground gave a soft low groan, and the fissure opened beneath the surface like an old wound, finally admitting the depth of itself. The water rose without ceremony. It simply appeared, green-black in the lantern light, filling a cavity in the rock shelf that ran the full width of the south pasture, and likely beyond, cold and clear and, this Clara understood, before she understood anything else, permanent. She stood there for a long moment, lantern held low, 90 Spanish dairy goats arranged behind her in the dark, like a congregation that had been waiting considerably longer than she had. The ringleader, a bony silver doe, Clara's neighbor girl Petra, had named Duchess, because Petra named everything, pressed her nose into the back of Clara's knee, and bleated once, as if to say, they had discussed this and there was a schedule. Clara Voss had paid $38 for all 90 of them. 18 months earlier, she had been the joke of Harlan County. 18 months before the water, before the Consolidated Dairy Company sent a man in a good coat from St. Louis and that man left with nothing he came for, before the spring rains returned and found only Clara's farm ready to receive them. 18 months before any of that, Clara Voss stood in the yard of the foreclosed Alderman Ranch on a blue November morning in 1886 and raised her hand at an auction where no one else was bidding. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Cobble who wore his skepticism openly and without apology, had looked at her hand, then at the lot he was selling, then back at her hand. The lot was 90 Spanish dairy goats acquired in a failed scheme by the previous owner. Gone now to a bank in Denver, the animals had been on short feed since August. They were gaunt and loud, and according to every man standing in that yard, near worthless Spanish goats, Murciano Granadinans, properly a breed almost no one in Harlan County had seen before, were considered ornamental at best, ridiculous at worst. They were too small, too leggy, too loud, and their milk, the men agreed with the authority of those who had never tasted it, was surely inferior. One farmer named Galt, who had a wide red face and the habit of making his opinions sound like facts, said a thing Clara heard from 20 feet away. He said, "Them goats ain't good for nothing but making noise and eating money," which raised a laugh from the men nearest him. Clara had $38 left in the world. Coble had knocked the lot down to her for the full 38 because there was no competing bid, and because he was in a hurry, and because the look on Clara's face was not the look of a woman who could be talked down. She had walked them home herself. All 90. It had taken the better part of a day, and it was the loneliest walk of her life. Not because she was by herself, but because the town watched from its porches and storefronts and shook its collective head at her back. Now it is worth saying something about Clara Voss, because the town had a story about her, and the story was not entirely wrong, but it was missing the important parts. The story the town told was this. Clara Voss was 24 years old, had come out from Ohio with her brother Eli 2 years prior to work the small parcel. Their uncle had deeded them in a moment of optimism, and her brother had died of a fever the following spring, leaving her alone on 43 acres of land that sat above a limestone shelf, which is to say, land that drained fast, baked hard, and cracked open its topsoil every dry summer, like a man peeling a sunburn. The town's conclusion was that the land was poor, and Clara was alone, and therefore she would fail, and the only question was the timing. What the town was missing was this. Clara Voss had grown up watching things. Not a passive watching, the watching of a person who believes that if you look long enough at anything, it will tell you what it is. She had watched the limestone country of Harlan County for 2 full years by the time she walked into that auction yard, and what she had concluded, quietly, in her own accounting, was that the rock shelf under her south pasture held water. It drained fast on top, yes, but it did not disappear. It went somewhere. And the Spanish goats she had read about in a 6-year-old copy of a German agricultural journal her uncle had left in the barn. She had read that page 40 times. She knew the sentences by heart. Those goats gave milk on scrub and rock and poor pasture, where dairy cattle could not survive. They could go where the water went. That was the arithmetic she was working with. $38 and a theory, and 90 starving nannies. The neighbor who understood the arithmetic was old Henrik Sobol, who farmed the eastern quarter section and had been in that country since before the town had a name for itself. Sobol was Czech, had farmed in 3 countries before this one, and had the particular quality of a man who has been surprised by failure, and surprise alike too many times to be impressed by either. He came to Clara's fence 3 days after the auction, leaned on it in the way of a man who has all day, and looked at the goats for a long while without speaking. Then he said, in the accented, measured English that always seemed to Clara to carry more weight per word than anyone else's, "They are ugly, your goats, but ugly does not mean useless. The ugliest things I have known have done the most work." Clara said she had noticed that too. Sobol said, "The land here, it is not poor. It is only proud. It keeps what it has. You must ask it correctly." He told her then about the limestone shelf, confirmed what she'd theorized, added what she had not known, which was that along the south pasture, the shelf ran shallow and in places almost reached the surface, and that, in a long enough dry spell, it might open. He had seen it once, 30 years ago in a drought year, he said. A thin crack, nothing useful, but the water was there. He tapped his chest. It is always there. You must only be patient enough to still be standing when it comes up. What Clara did not say, because she was not the kind of person who said things before they were proven, was that she intended to help it along. Through the winter, she worked. There is no softer word for what she did in those months. The goats needed feeding and she fed them. They needed worming and she wormed them. 3 of the duelings were so far gone when she got them that she sat up 3 nights running with a lamp and a bottle and her own body heat, and she brought 2 of the 3 through, which she counted as a fair result, and wept about only once, alone in the barn before dawn, which was when she allowed herself the luxury of feeling things. The first milk came in January, thin and sharp at first, then richer as the animals gained weight, with that high clean note that good goat milk carries. A note Clara recognized from the journal's description as the fat globules breaking fine, and she tasted it in the barn with the steam of her breath around her face and thought, there it is. There is the thing nobody in this county has tasted yet. She kept that information, the way a person keeps a coal banked low under ash. She told no one. Petra Sobol, who was 11 years old and appeared at Clara's fence most Saturday mornings because her father's farm adjoined the property and because Petra had the instinct of a person who goes where the interesting things are, had already claimed the goats as a personal responsibility. Petra named every individual animal. Duchess, who Clara had already noted, and Empress, and Lady Galt, which was funny because of the man who had mocked them at the auction, and so on down to the humblest doling, who was called Miss Particular because she refused to eat anything that had touched the ground. Clara let Petra help with morning and evening, feeding on the weekends, and Petra arrived with the solemnity of a person with a duty, and the goats, to their credit, seemed to take her seriously. By March, Clara had mapped the limestone shelf herself. She did this with a steel rod, a fence stake she had sharpened to a point, and a mallet, walking the south pasture in a grid pattern on the mornings when the ground was soft from the rare rain, driving the stake and feeling for the change in resistance. The rock was close in the southeast corner, within 18 inches of the surface in places. She drove the stake in those places deeper, angling, feeling. The water was there. She could feel it the way you sometimes feel a word on the tip of your tongue, a pressure, an imminence. She did not tell Sobol what she was doing, but Sobol watched and understood and said nothing, which was his way of approving. By April, she was selling milk. Quietly, to 3 households in the nearest town, Garfield Station, 4 miles east, delivering it herself in covered pails twice a week. She charged the price of good cow's milk, no more. She did not tell them what it was, only that it was fresh and sweet and guaranteed clean. The first week, a woman named Mrs. Faber, who was raising 4 children and a sick husband, and who bought on price rather than pride, came to her door on Thursday, instead of waiting for Monday's delivery. Clara thought something was wrong. Mrs. Faber said, "Whatever is in that pail you've been leaving, I need twice as much, and I will pay you for it right now." Her husband had been keeping nothing down for a week. The goat milk sat in him like medicine. He'd asked for a second cup. Clara said she would manage the twice-weekly delivery and the price would be the same. She drove home, thinking the thing she had been afraid to think. It was going to work. The town, however, had not changed its assessment. Through May and into the killing heat of June, when the rains stopped early and the creek that ran through Garfield Station dropped first to a trickle and then to a series of disconnected pools that smelled of mud and old iron, Harlan County began to dry out in the way that country always does, gradually, then terribly. Galt's cattle started losing weight. The Whitmore brothers, who had purchased a large dairy herd the previous autumn with borrowed money, had their 3 pastures going brown by June's second week. The creek that ran through the Whitmore land went dry in July. Clara's south pasture, above its limestone shelf, was doing something the neighbors hadn't noticed yet. The goats ranged it freely, and beneath their hooves the earth remained. Not wet, not green, but not cracked and pale either. There was moisture down there. The rock held it the way a cellar holds cold, releasing it slowly, and the scrub grass that the goats preferred was drawing on it and staying alive. Clara counted this every morning the way she counted everything. 90 animals, $38 invested, 5 households now on the milk route. She had added 2 more in June, and a south pasture that was quietly outperforming every acre of comparable ground in the county. She had kept the milk route small deliberately. She did not want the volume she couldn't control. She wanted the dependability that would outlast a drought. This was the arithmetic of survival. Not the most, but the enough, reliably. Sobal watched the creek from his own fence and said one evening in July, standing with Clara in the gold late light, "The year my father lost his farm in Bohemia. There was a year like this one. The men who held water held everything. The men who only held land held nothing." Clara stood beside him and did not say what she was going to say yet, which was that she believed she held water. She believed it was down there in the dark under the rock, and she believed it was a matter of weeks. It was then that the man from Consolidated came. His name, he said, was Aldred. He was from the regional office of the Consolidated Dairy Company of St. Louis, and he wore a coat that Clara estimated had cost more than her annual milk revenue thus far, and he arrived at her gate on a Tuesday, in the 3rd week of July, with a smile that had been practiced for a specific purpose. The purpose was this: Consolidated had identified, through their regional contacts in Garfield Station, that a woman named Voss was running a small goat dairy on the ridge above the creek valley, and that she had a supply of milk that continued through conditions in which every other dairy in the county had reduced or stopped production. Consolidated was interested in acquiring the herd. Clara offered him water and told him to say what he had come to say. Aldred said that Consolidated was prepared to be very fair. He said that the goats were, in his words, a peculiar breed that most buyers would not know what to make of, but that Consolidated had resources and could find a market for the animals. He quoted her a figure. The figure was $60. For all 90 animals. Clara looked at him for a moment. She did not look angry. She looked the way a person looks when they are doing arithmetic. She said, "I paid $38 for them starving. They are not starving now." Aldred said the market for Spanish goats was limited, and she would struggle to find another buyer. Clara said she had not been looking for a buyer. Aldred said that a woman running a place this size alone, in a dry year, she must be feeling the strain. Clara said she felt fine. Aldred left his card and said the offer would stand for 2 weeks. He did not say it pleasantly. He said it the way a man says a thing. He expects to be accepted out of necessity. What Aldred did not know, and what Clara had not said, was that the week before, She had let a buyer from a hotel kitchen in Wichita Falls taste the milk. The buyer's name was Morris, and he had come through Garfield Station on his way to a larger city, and Mrs. Faber had told him about it with the evangelical enthusiasm of a woman who has watched her husband recover. Morris had tasted the milk, and then the soft cheese Clara had begun making with the surplus, and then the firm, aged wheel she had been turning in her cellar for 6 weeks. Morris had said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What is the price per wheel?" Clara had told him. Morris had said he would take every wheel she could make, as many as she could make, and would come back monthly. And would she be willing to sign a purchase agreement? She had not yet signed it, because she was waiting to see what the south pasture would do. It showed her in the first week of August. The heat was absolute. The air above the pasture shimmered, and the far fence posts seemed afloat. But Clara had been watching a particular spot in the southeast corner for 10 days, watching how the goats drifted back to it in the afternoon when they should have been seeking shade, watching how the grass held its color there in a patch, roughly the diameter of a wagon wheel. She walked out there on the morning of August the 6th with the steel rod and drove it in at a new angle, and this time the resistance changed at 14 inches, and then shifted again, and then the rod went through into something, into a cavity, and water came up around the shaft, slow and dark and unmistakable. She pulled the rod and stood back. She thought about Sobel saying, "You must only be patient enough to still be standing when it comes up." She thought about Mrs. Faber's husband asking for a second cup. She thought about $38, 90 starving animals, 2 years on hard ground, and a German journal page she had read 40 times. She drove the rod in again in 5 more spots. Water at each one, rising, finding the surface the way water always does, with patience and with certainty, and without any interest in whether the situation was convenient. What she did next was not what anyone would have expected, because people rarely expect generosity from someone who has recently been offered $60 for a thing worth considerably more. What she did was go to Galt's fence and tell him that there was water under the south pasture shelf, and that the dry spell had thinned it enough to open, and that if his cattle were struggling, she could let them water there for the season. She said it without condition, only with the quiet certainty of someone who has earned the right to make an offer. Galt did not know what to say. He had said them goats ain't good for nothing, in that yard in November in front of everyone. He had made a joke of her, $38. He was a proud man, and he knew she knew it. He said, "That's a generous offer, Ms. Voss." Clara said it was a dry year, and she had water. That seemed like an arithmetic that answered itself. Within a week, she had opened the access to the Whitmore brothers as well, and to 2 other small operations along the ridge. She did not charge. She did ask each of them to help deepen the channel that the water was cutting through the limestone, to widen what was already opening, to let it breathe. They came with their own labor and their own tools, and they worked alongside her through August heat without any of them saying directly what they all understood, which was that the woman they had watched walk 90 ridiculous goats home from an auction in November had found the one thing in a drought year that mattered more than any of them had thought to look for. Sobel came and watched the work from his side of the fence, and when the channel was clear and the pool had formed, a pool that stretched, it turned out, across the full width of the south pasture, and then some, fed from below by water that the limestone shelf had been holding since before any of them had come to that country. Sobel climbed through the fence and walked to the edge of it and looked for a long time. He said, "This is what the land kept." Clara said, "You told me it was proud." He said, "I told you it keeps what it has. I did not know it kept this much. And here is the thing about that pool. It did not solve everything. A pool in the south pasture did not make grain cheap, or the heat bearable, or the months of work between then and the autumn any shorter. But it changed the arithmetic of the county in a way that settled fast and deep, the way water settles into limestone, quietly, completely, and in a manner that rearranges everything that was there before it. Aldred came back at the 2-week mark with his card and his coat, and the same offer. Clara was in the yard, with Morris, the hotel buyer, who had come out specifically to sign the cheese agreement, which was now extended to cover the spring's production through the following year, at prices that represented, in total, more than 3 times what Aldred had offered for the whole herd. Aldred looked at Morris. He looked at the pool, which was visible from the gate, with goats standing at its edge in the afternoon light, as if they had always known it was there. He looked at the 90 animals he had called peculiar, who were fat now, and loud in the way of animals that are doing exactly what they were made to do. He said, "You found water." Clara said she had found what was already there. He said, "I would like to revise my offer." Clara said, "The herd is not for sale at any price. The cheese is spoken for. The milk route I run myself. I am sorry you came all this way." She said it without heat, without triumph, in the quiet tone of a person who has already moved on to the next calculation. Aldred's revised offer, when he made it through a letter a week later, was $410 for the herd. Clara did not respond to the letter. There was nothing in it that required a response. What Aldred had not considered, what perhaps none of the men who had watched her walk those goats home had considered, was that Clara Voss was not operating under the assumption that the goal was to sell. The goal, in her arithmetic, had never been to sell. The goal had been to be still standing when the water came up. And here she was, standing. Petra Sobel came to help with the morning milking, the day after the pool opened, as she always did, and stood at the edge of the water in her work boots with her arms crossed, and looked at it with the expression of a child who has decided that something is correct. She said, Duchess knew, she was always going to that spot. Clara said, "I think you might be right." Petra said, "I want to name the pool." Clara said, that seemed fair, given she had named everything else. Petra thought about it for 3 steps, and then said, "The common pool, because it's for everybody." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "That was the right name. It was the right name. It stuck." The men who came to water their cattle used it. The Whitmore brothers used it in a letter to a cousin in Kansas who was suffering a similar dry season and asked how the Ridge Farms had managed. The name appeared in the Garfield Station Register the following spring in a short piece about the drought survival strategies of the county's smaller operations, a piece that mentioned Clara Voss by name and described her as having, through unconventional methods, provided a resource to the broader community that outlasted the worst dry stretch in local memory. The journalist from the Register, a young man named Tu, who wrote with more enthusiasm than precision, had asked Clara what she attributed her success to, expecting something quotable about faith or fortitude. Clara had thought about it for a moment and then said, "I believed the ground was keeping something. I just kept working until I was right." Tu had found this insufficient for his purposes and had written around it with his own language, but the people who knew Clara read through his language to hers, and hers was the sentence that remained. It is worth following the thread of the other parties through to their ends, because a story is incomplete if it stops at the protagonist's triumph without accounting for what the rest of the world did with itself. Galt watered his cattle through August and September at the common pool, and lost none of his herd. He was a man who did not apologize in words, but who expressed contrition through the precision of his deeds. And at the county harvest social that October, he carried 2 of Clara's milk crates from her wagon without being asked, with the careful attention of a man who is handling something that belongs to someone who has been correct about things he was wrong about. It was not an apology. It was the nearest thing Galt could manage, and Clara accepted it without comment, which was her version of grace. The Whitmore brothers, who had been on the edge of losing their dairy investment to the bank, pulled through the season with the pool's help, and came out in November with a herd intact and a humility they hadn't carried before the drought. They came to Clara in October, together, which was the way the Whitmore brothers always did things, and said they wanted to purchase milk regularly, having tried the goat's milk through the summer and found their own children preferred it. They said they would pay her rate. Clara set the rate, and they paid it, and they were her customers for 7 years after that, without incident. Aldred did not return personally, but a second letter arrived from Consolidated in October, offering a partnership arrangement rather than a purchase. They would supply capital, and she would supply product, and they would share profit in a proportion that Clara read once and then put in the stove, without answering. She was not opposed to scale, but she was opposed to any arrangement that put the common pool under a company letterhead. The water had gone to the county. It would stay there. Sobol came for coffee on the first cold morning of October, and sat at her table and looked out the window at the pasture, where the pool was lower, now that the rains had returned and the pressure beneath the shelf had equalized, but still there, still permanent. He said, "You remember what I told you about the land and what it keeps?" Clara said she remembered. He said, "I told you to ask it correctly. I think you asked it correctly." She said, "I had help understanding what to ask." He looked at her with the expression of a man who knows he is being credited with more than his share and who accepts it because arguing is inefficient. He drank his coffee. They sat in the quiet of the October morning and listened to the goats in the pasture, which sounded like what it was, a full, prosperous, undignified noise, the sound of 90 animals that had been starving when they arrived and were starving no longer. On the pasture's edge, Duchess had planted herself at the highest point of the limestone shelf, looking out over the pool and the autumn-brown grass with the dignity of an animal that has always known exactly what it was worth and has simply been waiting for the situation to catch up. Clara Voss watched her through the window and thought that this was an attitude she had some sympathy for. The cheese operation expanded through that winter. Clara hired Petra for real wages in the spring, not charity wages, real ones. Negotiated by Petra herself with a seriousness Clara respected, and Petra came after school 3 days a week and all day Saturday and learned the curing and the turning and the careful calculation of the aging cellar. By the following autumn, when Petra was 12, she could grade a wheel by weight and smell with an accuracy that Morris had confirmed in writing, which was the kind of confirmation Petra framed in her mind, though not on any wall, because she was Sobol's daughter and did not go in for display. The milk route grew to 14 households and 2 restaurant accounts and a small contract with the railway hotel in the nearest city, which had been introduced through Morris and which required Clara to hire a second driver for the twice-weekly run. The driver she hired was a quiet boy named Samuel, from a family that had been pushed hard by the drought, a boy who showed up the first morning before she had expected him, and who proved, over the following months, to be the kind of reliable that comes from having needed reliability and not found it, and therefore understanding its value. The South Pasture Pool settled into the life of the county the way that useful things settle in, so completely that by the second year it was difficult to remember the county before it. Cattle watered there through 2 more dry spells over the next decade. Children caught crawdads in it. In the deep summer, it was the color of green glass in the late afternoon, when the light came across it at the angle that made the limestone beneath it visible, pink and white and ancient, a record of water going back farther than anyone in Harlan County had been alive to see. Clara had found it for $38 and a theory and the willingness to drive a steel rod into the ground at 14-inch intervals across an entire pasture, on a hunch she was not entirely certain was a hunch, rather than a wish. The distinction between a hunch and a wish is patience. A wish dissolves when the situation gets hard. A hunch deepens. Clara's hunch about the water had deepened through every dry month, every mocking comment, every morning of work that produced no visible result, and it had been correct, as hunches of that particular depth usually are, not because the world rewards stubbornness, but because stubbornness applied to the right thing in the right direction, with the right quality of attention, is simply another word for knowing. Sobol had said it again. Near the end, in the October of that first full year, when the pool was established and the cheese contract was signed, and the $38 had long since become an amount that made the original sum almost comic in proportion. He had said it without occasion, just standing at her fence in the way he stood at fences, looking at things. He said, "The ugliest things I have known have done the most work." Clara said, "You told me that the first time." He said, "I am telling you again because now you know what I meant." She did. She knew exactly what he meant. She had known since January, in the barn, with the first milk warm in her hands, and the steam of her breath in the lamplight, and 90 goats breathing around her in the dark. 90 animals that the county had agreed were worth nothing, breathing together in the dark, alive. productive, and entirely unconcerned with what the county had agreed. That is the thing about a drought. It clarifies. It strips away what was only flourishing because the conditions were easy, and what it leaves behind is what was actually built on something. When the rains returned to Harlan County in the autumn of 1887, they came back to a place that had been changed by what the dry year had revealed. Not what it had taken, but what it had shown, which was where the water truly was, and whose hands had known to find it, and what it meant to have been the only person standing in that county who had thought to ask the right question of the ground, before the ground had any reason to answer. The goats were not beautiful. They were leggy and loud and opinionated, and they ate everything that wasn't nailed down, and several things that were. Duchess continued to behave as though the common pool had been her idea. Miss Particular continued to refuse anything that had touched the ground. Lady Galt, Petra's joke that had stopped being funny to the man it named, and had therefore become more permanently funny to everyone else, was the most productive dairy animal in the herd by the following spring, a fact that Clara kept to herself with a warmth she saw no reason to share publicly. The $38 remained, the amount. Clara never forgot it. She kept the receipt from Cobble's auction in the frame of the barn door, folded and weather-stained, because it was the record of the exact moment when the arithmetic had been laid out in front of her. Everything she had, and everything that no one else wanted, and she had said yes, and meant it, and walked 90 starving animals home in the November cold, and begun. And, every morning, from that first morning onward, before the light came, when the lantern was swinging at her knee, and the south pasture was dark ahead of her, and the goats were coming behind her in that particular shuffling chorus they made at dawn, there was a moment, always, when Clara Voss was alone in the middle of what she was building, and the only sound was the limestone country settling in the cold, and the water moving under it, patient and permanent and absolutely certain of where it was going. She was always glad, in that moment, that she had stopped to listen.